So our first speaker this afternoon is T. Davies-Barnard from the University of Exeter, who's going to be talking about the evaluation of terrestrial nitrogen fixation in CMIP6 models. And you're on mute, T.
Yeah, that's better, isn't it? Can you? Sorry about that. So I'm going to first start off by saying thank you to my boss, Pierre, and also my my sort of adopted boss, Zonka, and to one of our colleagues who's no longer with us, Johannes Meyer-Holt, all of whom had a lot of influence on this work. So I'm going to focus in this talk on kind of the before and after, really, of CRESCENDO and CMIP6. So what do we know now about biological nitrogen fixation in terrestrial environments that we didn't know before CRESCENDO? So just very brief background: biological nitrogen fixation is plants more precisely, usually cyanobacteria in association with plants or on their own independently, providing fixation of nitrogen into, in this case, the terrestrial biosphere. It's a significant part of the nitrogen cycle. It's a very significant part of the new nitrogen into the cycle, and it's you know, we don't exactly know how big it is, but hopefully we know better now than we used to. So the situation before CRESCENDO was that there was a set of different estimates of how big biological nitrogen fixation was, that ranged from anything from sort of 40 teragrams per year to some that were well over 300 teragrams per year. So a really, really big range, depending on who you spoke to. And the work that I did with Pierre, doing a sort of bottom-up estimation, was, I mean, let's not face it, I haven't narrowed the range much, but I have narrowed it somewhat. And our best estimate is significantly below the sort of the general consensus that we've had of kind of 100 to 125, that kind of amount that's been sort of kicking around for a few years. Ours is more like 89. So it is significantly lower, and has but still has a fair sized range, but much less than 350. But the really key part of it is that actually there's a big shift in our understanding of where that BNF actually comes from. So really the only map of the spatial distribution of BNF has come from Cleveland et al. 1999. So it's 20 years old, or 15 years old at the beginning of CRESCENDO, and has this sort of range where it almost 40 teragrams, almost 40 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year in these sort of tropical forest areas. Whereas our estimate says actually the maximum is much, much lower. So in the sort of 10 to 15 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And it's not in the tropics. So this is really sort of taking away that paradigm of really strong latitudinal gradient of BNF, and saying, well, it's probably not the case actually. So that has some pretty significant impacts for our understanding of fixation, and then the knock-on effect on NPP and all those things as well. And we can see that the CMIP6 models, understandably, are still working on that old paradigm. On the right-hand side, this is the multi-model mean of CMIP6 models for the historical period, and the which is sort of equivalent to the upscaled values that we've got on the left. So yeah, so there's still some work to be done there. But what is interesting is that when we look at all of the CMIP6 models, we can see that actually the crescendo models are not doing too badly overall. In the big scheme of things, this is from ILAM. I know that's a bit of a swear word around here, but we can see that there are some models that are really quite out, and then there's some of the better models are the crescendo models. So that's quite hopeful. Another thing that we know now that we didn't know before was that our models seem to be having a kind of dichotomy between a CO2 response and an N response. So we can see on these plots that they're plotting the CO2 MPP response and the plus N MPP response, and on a grid cell basis, and at each individual grid cell, the pattern is generally clustered along the two axes. If they were sort of responding together, like if a location had both CO2 and N response at a grid cell level, you would expect some kind of, either a stochastic or a kind of positive relationship, but we're a long way from that. You can see that also that most of the purple area, which is the high latitudes, tends to be more nitrogen responsive, and the mid to low latitudes tend to be more CO2 responsive. And although by the time you average things even to a sort of multi-pixel level, multi-grid cell level, or a biome level, you mix that up and you don't see this pattern anymore. It is there, and we don't fully understand why. And I think this is an important thing that we now know that we have this this dichotomy. Looking at the sort of the future scenarios in CMIP6, this is slightly speculative, but I think that it's quite interesting to look at how the BNF has a kind of an effect and is symptomatic of wider differences between the models in terms of their nitrogen cycle. So these plots are a little bit confusing, but hold with me. So along the radials, what you've got is the normalized change in between the beginning and the end of the SSP 370 scenario. Okay, so and
2 minutes.
Great. So if they're far out, then they're changing a lot, and if they're further in, then they're not changing very much. And we can see that there's kind of three groups, or I've grouped them by their BNF, and these ones are BNF that is run by the MPP. These ones are from evapotranspiration, and these are the other. And vaguely speaking, we can say that the BNF is about proportional to the change in MPP. For these ones, the BNF change is smaller than for MPP, and for these ones, the BNF change is bigger than the MPP. And the knock-on effects, or perhaps the model structure, has somewhat dictated the BNF. It's not clear which way around that is. Mean that they have quite different patterns of how they're using nitrogen and responding to new nitrogen in the model, and how that relates to the MPP. And it's not at all clear which of these is, in inverted commas, correct. or yeah. So there's some sort of structural differences, and BNF is actually quite nicely symptomatic of these structural differences in the models. So yeah, I mean, kind of in summary, models are getting BNF wrong to a greater or lesser extent, and we don't know which ones of these models are more or less wrong than others, and we still have some work to do on whether kind of relating that to the real world. So that's pretty much it for me. Thank you for listening. There will be some of this in forthcoming papers, but I am just going to take a moment to say that my new job, is under threat because the UK government have decided to reduce the aid budget, which means that the Official Development Assistance Project, which funds my current job, has been, the budget for research has been halved literally for this year. Yeah, there's a petition on Twitter. This is a significant thing for UK researchers and for their partners globally. But also, if you hear of any jobs, just give me a shout. So yeah, so back to thank you to Pierre and Zonka and Johannes, and yeah, thanks very much, and I'd be pleased to take any questions.
Thank you, T, and sorry to hear that news. And so we have one question from Colin. Given the massive difference in tropical BNF between the earlier estimates based on observations and your new estimates, and given that CMIP6 models look to be like the old estimates, what would be the implication for GPP and CO2 uptake if the models looked more like your new BNF estimates?
So theoretically, if you take BNF in isolation and you just say there's less BNF, there are papers that show quite neatly that it's a serious problem, that you have less GPP in the models, and then you have less carbon storage overall, and et cetera, et cetera. In practice, I think that the models have been set up in such a way that actually something else would account for it. You certainly can't, across the CMIP models, you can't say this one has less BNF and therefore it has less carbon storage or less GPP. It just doesn't work like that. What we're seeing is that models that have less BNF have greater flexibility in, say, C to N ratios, or they have more mineralization, or whatever it is. So mostly the models are making up for, they're balancing their nitrogen books one way or the other. But the reality of what that really looks like in the real world, as opposed to what it looks like in model world, is much more dubious. I don't know if that answers it, but hopefully.
Thank you, T. There's also a comment in the chat that you can look at. So in the interest of time, let's on to our next speaker. It's Mea Costantini from CNRM, who's going to talk to us about the impact of climate change on groundwater.
Can you stop sharing, please?
Sorry, yep, found the button. Sorry.
That's all right, cheers.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can. Thank you, Mea.
Okay, so hello, I'm Maya Costantini, PhD student at the CNRM, and I will present you my work about the response to climate change of groundwater in aquifers. So first, what are aquifers? They are permeable geological structures which can contain groundwater and thus freshwater resources. Here on the map, you can see the location of major aquifers, and the knowledge of their evolution with climate change is an important issue. To study the aquifer evolution at global scale, we analyze the simulation conducted into different scenarios under the CMIP6 experiments. We use the global climate models developed in our institute, which are CNRM CM6 and CNRM ESM2. And for each scenarios, all the simulation available was used. In the CNRM models, the surface component is bathystrip, allow the physical and realistic simulation of the continental hydrology, and include a parameterization of aquifer processes. At the bottom, you can see the map representing the aquifer basins which are simulated in our model. In this study, the evolution of aquifers is assessed via the analysis of the changes in the piezometric head of groundwater. This is what I schematize here. So you can see the surface and the vadose zone, which allow water infiltration through soils toward aquifers, and which participate to their recharge, mainly with water from precipitation. The piezometric head is defined by the level of water referred to the ground, and this variable is here called water table depth, or WTD. So in order to study the evolution of groundwaters, we compare their WTD between two 30 years periods, one in present and the other in future. Here on the maps, you can see the percentage of WTD evolution in the future scenarios compared to their condition in the present period. The blue regions correspond to an increase of the water level in aquifers, and inversely orange regions, the evolution is not statistically significant according to the test of false discovery rate, which is based on a student test. And first, we can see that at global scale, in all scenarios, the mean WTD increase, but even if the global mean level of water in aquifer increase, there is large regional disparities. For example, while we can see a strong increase in the high latitudes, there is also strong decreases in the Mediterranean region, the southern South Africa, and in the western United States. The global increase of WTD is consistent with the expected intensification of the hydrological cycle, as precipitation are the main driver of aquifer evolution in our models. Indeed, here you can see the same maps, but with precipitation, at which I add the border of our aquifer basins. And we can see a strong spatial correlation in the evolution trend of these two variables. Basically, where precipitation increase, the water level also increase, and vice versa. And this is more apparent in these maps, where you have in blue the regions where WTD and precipitation increase, and inversely in red. In white, the places where the signal of neither WTD nor precipitation is statistically significant. And in purple, the few places where the WTD and precipitation evolution are not the same. After this study of evolution in the CNRM models, we wanted to compare our results with those of the CMIP6 models, but the problem was that the CNRM models are the only global climate models simulating the physical processes involving aquifers, so the comparison with the WTD variable of the other CMIP6 models was not possible. A solution was to use precipitation variable instead of WTD. We showed earlier that there is a strong spatial correlation between the precipitation and WTD evolution trends, because the aquifer recharge comes mainly from precipitation. Thus, studying the multimodal precipitation evolution allows to indirect study the aquifer evolution. So for this study, we use 18 global climate models, and as for the CNRM models, all the simulation available was used. Here you can see the percentage of precipitation evolution according to the other CMIP6 models, with the dotted areas which correspond to those where 90% of the models agreed on the evolution trend of precipitation. According to that, they seem to have a consensus over the signal in the high latitudes in all scenarios, and also in the Mediterranean region in the two worst scenarios. Now here at right, I compared the seeing of the precipitation signal of the CMIP6 models with the signal with the seeing of the CNRM models, with in blue the places where the two of them agreed in an increase of precipitation and inversely in red. And in purple, there is the places where the trends of the precipitation evolutions are not the same. Considering that a majority of purple areas correspond to areas not statistically significant in the CNRM models, we can say that for the precipitation evolution trend, our model seems quite consistent with the CMIP6 model. And this way, indirectly, they are also quite consistent for the WTD evolution trend. Finally, we wanted to know what will be the possible consequences of the aquifer future evolution for the population's water requirements. To do that, we compared the WTD evolution with projections of population's density evolution. Here you can see at the left side the population density in 2015, and at the right side the projected population density at the beginning of the 22nd century. The projections was made thanks to the CMIP6 scenarios of population density evolution by countries. And for example, you can see an increase in population density in United States, Europa, and Africa, and a decrease in Asia and India. These maps synthesize the information on WTD and population density evolution. You have in blue areas with an increase of water level in aquifers and a decrease in red. The darkness of the color represents the future population density. For example, this shows that in the Mediterranean and Sahara region, the mean WTD change is around -6%. 90% of the area with aquifers will suffer a diminution of their water level, and 27 of them will be highly populated. This
2
can
minutes.
be Okay, this can be a huge problem because the decrease of WTD associated with an high population density widens the risk of water stress in this already groundwater dependent region. With this map, we can also see that India presents mainly an increase of water level, but the majority of the region will be highly populated. Thus, with the growing human water requirements for industry, people life, and especially agriculture, the projected water level increase will be possibly reversed in a decrease. Therefore, to better represent the groundwater evolution in aquifers, it is essential to take into account anthropogenic effects like irrigation. And indeed, irrigation is not represented in the global climate models, and this constitutes the main limitation of this study. You can see here with the map that Spain, which according to our results will suffer a decrease of groundwater level and an increase of population density, is in addition already highly irrigated and thus dependent of aquifer. So our projected decreases here are probably underestimated. And this is why one of the objectives of my future work will be to implement a parameterization of irrigation processes inside the CNRM models. To conclude, the important points of my presentation was that according to our models, the global mean water level in aquifer is projected to increase, but with large regional disparities. There is a strong spatial link between the evolution of precipitation and groundwater level, and this link allows us to say that our results are consistent with those of the other CMIP6 model. And finally, by coupling our results with future population density, we can see that the risk of water stress in some regions is maybe worse than our estimation, and this highlights the necessity to represent irrigation processes in the global climate models. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Maya, and thank you for keeping within time. There's no questions in the chat at the moment, but I'd encourage you to keep an eye on it in case anything appears. You mentioned the lack of irrigation representation in Earth system models. I also wondered what role resolution of models might come into play in the future projections and ability of models to represent changes in WTD.
Yes, it's a good question. In our model, we modelize the major groundwater basins because the resolution of the model is 0.5 degrees, and it's not allow us to represent more little variation of more little aquifer basins, but for first results at global scales, it can give a good idea of the evolution of aquifer on the Earth. And for irrigation, this is the same problem. But we know that we have already some maps, for example, like this from the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, which can help us at the beginning to know which areas are irrigated and to base our future projections with this map.
Thank you, Maya. There is another question in the chat from Colin, so can I encourage you to go to the chat and try and answer it there. Thank you, Maya. Let's move on to our next speaker, who's Eleanor Burke from the Office Hadley Centre, who's going to be talking to us about permafrost in the CMIP6 models.
Okay, good afternoon. Apologies to those that have actually seen this talk. It's been given to the UKESM project group. So I'm talking about analysis of permafrost I've done in CMIP6. I'm going to whip through it fairly quickly for the introductions. This is just an example of a permafrost landscape, and one thing to just note is that it's really, really heterogeneous with lots of different land cover types which influence what's going on underneath the soil. Another quick picture. So permafrost is defined as land or soil that's frozen for at least 2 years or more. What happens is this sort of active layer at the top of the permafrost, which thaws and freezes, and then the soil underneath stays permanently frozen. And if you go deep enough, you come to the bottom of the permafrost because of the geothermal gradient. There are a lot of ice wedges in the permafrost, and if that ice wedge should melt, you might get some substance like the picture on the right, which is actually about 1 kilometre across. And there's all sorts of interesting, again, landscapes which are a result of the freezing and thawing processes going on. So it's quite a complex process that we represent in the model. We would like to represent in the models. Another issue we have is that there are not very many observations. So it's very difficult to access permafrost regions. And so there are very, very sparse observations. And this is just an example of a few boreholes which have been monitored for the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years. And these observations suggest that there have been observed increases in permafrost temperature in these borehole measurements, but again, very, very sparse across the Arctic region. So one way of estimating whether you have permafrost present or not is just to use the mean annual air temperature, and it's a very crude estimate, but And obviously there are some wide uncertainty bands because the permafrost itself doesn't just depend on the air temperature, but we have this derived relationship, which is was derived by Chadbourne et al. Based on the observations. And if we use that to define the permafrost extent, we actually, this is the ensemble mean of the CMIP6 models, we actually get a fairly good estimate of the permafrost probability. So the brown is showing the outline of the permafrost regions. The dark purple has a probability of permafrost about 1, and as you come southwards, you get a decrease in probability of permafrost. So that's an ensemble probability. So we are getting fairly good estimates of permafrost compared to the observations if we just use that relationship from air temperature. And another way to look at it is if we've got biases in our climate model, so our air temperature might be slightly off, we can look at the area of permafrost as a proportion of the area where the mean annual air temperature is less than 0, which is the right-hand plot. And we see that we have a very, very narrow range of about 0.56 to about 0.58. So it's a really fairly narrow range. So even if we have our air temperature off, you can still get sort of the proportion of permafrost within that region correct. If you just derive it from air temperature, you get a permafrost area between 11 and 19 million square kilometres, and the observations are the red line in the middle, which are about 15 square kilometres. So that's one way of looking at permafrost. Another way is to look at the soil temperatures. So if you take the soil temperatures that are output from the model at a depth, you can get an estimate. If it's always below 0, you get an estimate of the probability of permafrost. And that soil temperature is influenced by the snow, it's influenced by the vegetation, and it's influenced by the thermal properties of the soil. However, the main influence is the snow insulation. So if you have nice thick snow, you get a good insulation of the soil, and it doesn't get as cold as the air temperature. And that really, really keeps the soil a lot warmer and influences the presence of permafrost. So one of the things that I've looked at is how well the snow insulation behaves in the different models. And so that we're looking at the blue lines here for the CMIP6 models, and we're comparing it to an observed estimate, which is the black dotted line with the error bars. And we can see that actually, as a general rule, the models aren't doing too badly with their estimate of snow insulation. There may be 1 or 2 that are slightly off. And you can see in the figure that the soil insulation and the vegetation insulation aren't half as dominant. So not too bad in our relationship, in our ability of our models to generate the snow insulation as a function of the annual mean air temperature. So assuming that's the dominant process, we can then look at the permafrost extent. This is derived from the soil temperatures themselves, and we are still getting quite a lot of variation between the models, with models ranging from like 7.2 million square kilometres to about 26 million square kilometres. And you can kind of clearly see that there are vast overestimates or underestimates of the permafrost in some of those models. So as soon as you put the land surface scheme in and try and represent permafrost from the soil temperature, you're getting a much, much larger uncertainties in that estimate. And you can see that again here. So this is the figure we looked at earlier, where the area of permafrost as proportion of the area where the annual mean air temperature is less than 0. And this is the figure earlier with a slightly different scale. And we look at the figure on the right, which is the same thing, but derived using soil temperatures. And we get quite a large spread in comparison. So really there's still some work to be done on the land surface components of these models to ensure that we actually get a more realistic permafrost presence. So this is just looking at the soil configuration, so the total depth of the soil and the total number of layers in the soil, and these are parameters that really affect whether you can simulate permafrost and also whether you can simulate the maximum summer thaw depth. So if you only have 4 layers in the top 3 meters, it's much harder to estimate the maximum summer thaw depth, and at 3 meters your temperature is still sensitive to variations within the year. So you really want to be looking at much deeper soil where the variations within the year do not affect the temperature, and you also need much higher resolution soil so that you can more accurately determine the maximum summer thaw depth.
2 minutes.
So this is just a figure showing the maximum summer thaw depth. The observations are in blue, and we're comparing the maximum summer thaw depth as a function of the annual mean air temperature. And you can see generally as you get warmer, the maximum summer thaw depth gets larger, there are much larger uncertainties. And as you get colder, your maximum summer thaw depth is much shallower, but the uncertainties are much smaller. And there's generally the ability of the models to represent this is fairly poor. Some of them do better than others, but there still remains quite a lot of work to be done. Just a quick look at future projections. So we've used, the left one is just using the air temperature to define the permafrost, and that assumes there's some equilibrium between the current state of the permafrost and the air temperature, which might not necessarily be true in a changing climate and the soil has some thermal inertia, but that's an estimate, and we're getting about a loss of 3.3 to 4.1 million square kilometres per degree. Total permafrost area is about 15 million square kilometres, but the projections are fairly consistent. On the right, this is using the soil temperatures to define your permafrost, and we have slightly slower loss, but we do have quite a lot of uncertainty in those results. Okay, we care because permafrost has a lot of carbon. Not many of the CMIP6 models have representation of permafrost carbon, so that's something that really needs to be worked on. So what we have when we have CMIP6 improving over CMIP5, we have better snow insulation from some of the models. We do not have a much better summer thaw depth estimate, and we still have too shallow soils and not enough soil layers. And we still need more of the CMIP6 models to have a representation of the permafrost carbon. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. There's a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is from Colin. Did any of the CMIP6 models include interactive permafrost? So there you've been diagnosing permafrost extent from soil and air temperatures, but did any of them include it interactively?
Sorry, Colin, I don't understand that question.
I guess he's also referring to carbon and methane as well. So any of them diagnosing interactive emissions, for example?
Well, there's a couple that have a permafrost carbon pool, and will have some emissions. I haven't looked specifically at the carbon side just because there are literally, I think it's anything CLM based will have a permafrost carbon pool, but nothing else. Yeah.
And a question from Victor, could your method tell how good models are in simulating zero curtain in ground temperature during freezing thawing cycles?
So the zero curtain occurs because it takes quite a lot of energy to change state of the water to change state. So you can have the soil at 0 for quite a long time, even though because it's getting the energy that it needs to change state. I haven't looked at zero curtain at all, and I know Jules in particular doesn't quite have a long enough zero curtain, but I haven't looked at it in any of these models.
Thank you, Eleanor. In the interest of time, we will need to move on, but I think there's also a question in the chat from Pat Hyder, if you could take a look. Our next speaker is Chris Jones, also from the Hadley Centre, who's is going to tell us about quantifying process level uncertainty, contributions to TCRE and carbon budgets. Over to you, Chris.
Great, thanks, Fiona. Yeah, like Eleanor, also apologies to people who may have seen some of this before in the UK. There's a sort of a theme of recycling, which I think is very commendable. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we dig into some of the processes behind the things that control TCRE, which I'll explain, and ultimately the carbon budgets for meeting climate targets. So quick bit of background, the fact that the last IPCC report introduced the concept of carbon budgets and the fact that global warming was related almost linearly to the cumulative amount of CO2 emission rather than the individual pathway, and the fact that the special report on 1.5 then developed a kind of slightly more systematic framework for looking at the different components of that. And then I'll talk about how carbon cycle feedbacks sort of fit into that framework and go through the metrics and the uncertainty in those, how they've changed between CMIP 5 and CMIP 6, and talk about the role of missing processes as well. So basically, total CO2 emissions are strongly linked to the total amount of warming. So that was a key message from the last IPCC report. So the warming is very much dependent on the cumulative emission of carbon rather than the pathway, and that allows us to quantify a particular budget, a total amount of carbon that we can burn or spend to meet that target. And effectively, this draws together all of climate science, all of the processes and feedbacks into that kind of single straight line, which is a really nice sort of simplifying concept. But it also means when there are uncertainties, it's hard to know where they've come from. So it's important to also be able to unpick this. How do I move again? So what you do is you define a warming level, 2 degrees, for example, and read off that. But there's no account taken in the AR5 kind of treatment of this of errors and biases up to the present day. There's no account of variability, things like the hiatus. It's hard to consider the role of non-CO2. So there are 2 lines on this graph which include non-CO2 forcing or CO2 only, and they're quite different. And there's no real process understanding of where that uncertainty comes from. So the 1.5 degree report kind of tried to address some of this by kind of slightly redrawing that figure and splitting it into 5 different components. So we have kind of a historical warming to date, and after that we see then the model branches away in terms of letting the uncertainty spread out. The TCRE, this transient climate response to emissions, is still the central part. So that's the gradient of this line that relates warming to emissions. But then you have a couple of specific correction terms that you apply to your kind of target warming. You make an adjustment for the zero emission commitment, which I won't discuss in detail here. And then you can make another correction for the non-CO2 contribution. And then you can read off a carbon budget. And then finally, there's an adjustment for any unrepresented feedbacks, so things that are not included in that TCRE gradient. So for example, permafrost, because that's not included in the models that have led to the gradient. Okay, so that's the background. Now a little bit about carbon cycle feedback metrics. So the way we evaluate the carbon cycle feedbacks is to sort of linearize the system. We use the 1% per year simulations, and we measure the climate response to CO2, a term called alpha, which is effectively the climate sensitivity, so, or in fact the transient climate response, but also the carbon cycle response to CO2 and to climate. So we have a beta term that measures the response to CO2, that's sort of on land what you call CO2 fertilization, and a gamma term that measures the response to climate change. And we do simulations which are either fully coupled, where all of these things are varying, or we have a biogeochemically coupled run where we take out the effects of climate change, and the carbon cycle only sees a varying CO2, and that allows us to diagnose beta and reconstruct the other terms. So that's our feedback framework. And you can see, so these are the results for the land changes in carbon cycle going into the future, well, going into the 1% CO2 rise. We see an increase, the green arrow here, due to CO2, so that's the term beta. We see a decrease due to climate only, that's the red line here, gamma, and the combined response in blue. But you also notice there's a really substantial model spread. There's a really big plume of uncertainty around these things, and it's important to understand what that means for the carbon budgets calculation. So what you can do is you can reconstruct the things you want to know, so the TCRE relationship, and also the airborne fraction, which is the fraction of how much anthropogenic emissions stay in the atmosphere. We can reconstruct these things from the alpha, beta and gamma terms. And that in itself is not particularly useful, because if you can diagnose those, then you already know what TCRE is in your model from the same experiments. But what it lets you do is then propagate through where the uncertainty is and which terms have an impact on the quantities that you care about. So if we do reconstruct here TCRE from those feedback metrics, you can see actually there's a really strong agreement along this one-to-one line. So this reconstruction works really well. So that shows that this linear feedback framework is still really quite relevant, I think. And we've got here 3 generations of carbon cycle models now. So we go right back to the original 2006 set of models from C4MIP. We have the CMIP5 set in orange and the CMIP6 set in green, and they all still kind of obey this relationship. So we know that we can reconstruct TCRE from these feedback metrics. And that means we can actually look then at what's driving the uncertainty in TCRE and the airborne fraction. So, for example, the airborne fraction, these bar charts show that the uncertainty is almost entirely dominated by beta. So these green bars show the land in the dark and the ocean in the paler green contribution to the model spread in airborne fraction. And again, split by the different generations of MIPs, so C4 MIP, CMIP5, CMIP6, and then a combination of all of them. And so if you care about what fraction of emissions stay in the atmosphere, it's almost entirely dependent on how the carbon sinks respond to CO2. If you care about the climate change that will result from that, it becomes jointly controlled by beta and alpha. And if we went back to CMIP5, it was almost exactly a 50-50 split, that the climate response to CO2 and the carbon cycle response to CO2 were kind of half and half controlling the climate change. That's changed a lot by CMIP6, and what we see now is actually a much reduced contribution from the carbon cycle uncertainty and a much bigger variance explained from the climate uncertainty. So that's
2 minutes.
Okay, I will step through a little bit quicker then. So you can propagate these through. This basically shows the same thing. You can look at the different airborne fraction and TCRE terms, and when you compare CMIP5 and 6, you see that the CMIP6 spread of airborne fraction has reduced quite a lot, but the TCRE hasn't. But we see that the uncertainty feeding into that is really quite different. So what does that mean for carbon budgets? So 3 of those components in the framework we talked about from the 1.5 degree report. So the zero emission commitment, I haven't had a chance to show any results today. There's no change to the assumption that that's approximately 0, but that is now backed up by model simulations, and there are papers that have come out on that. For TCRE, there's no change in the magnitude since CMIP5, but there's a big change in the source of the uncertainty. And in particular, we think that the role of the nitrogen cycle has had a big impact to reduce the spread of the land carbon and leaving a greater role for the climate response uncertainty. And then very quickly, I'm just going to mention what I think the next step should be. The other part of the framework has an adjustment process for missing processes or unrepresented processes. And that's a bit problematic when you have an ensemble of models where some include a process and some don't. And we don't yet have a framework that can adjust for partially included processes. So this would have to be done model by model. So you can see, for example, the red stars on here from CMIP 5 and the blue and CMIP 6 has been an increase in the number of components. So we've got now about half of the models have a nitrogen cycle. We heard from Philippe this morning that the next generation IPSL model will probably have all three of these: permafrost, nitrogen and dynamic vegetation, but we're going to have to cope somehow with having an ensemble that has very different levels of complexity, and we don't yet have a framework on how to deal with that, but we know that these terms have different impacts on TCRE, so we need to find some way of adjusting that when we put all of these models together into a single line. Right, so I will wrap up then just with some conclusions. So CMIP 6 now is the third generation of carbon cycle ESMs. The headline numbers, particularly for TCRE, might not look that different from CMIP 5, but there's been quite a lot of progress, and a big concentration from CRESCENDO has been the introduction of a terrestrial nitrogen cycle. And we heard from T, obviously, that the land models still have a lot to do in terms of their evaluation and understanding the processes within that nitrogen cycle. So we're still only just scratching the surface of how it works. But that's, that's been a major contribution to actually reducing the spread across the models. And finally, we need to be able to account for this mixed complexity within our ensembles. So I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. There's a number of questions in the chat. I'll just, in the interest of time, ask you one, and it's from Colin. He says, I've asked you this before. Oh, and it's moving, sorry. Let me retrieve it. Airborne fraction is less in models that includes nitrogen limitation. That seems the opposite of what you might expect from the impact of nitrogen on photosynthetic response. Can you comment?
Yeah, I think it's just the fact that the models have changed a lot. I think we know from UKSM, if we do simulations with and without the nitrogen cycle, the airborne fraction increases when you include the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle limits the amount of land uptake and leaves more in the atmosphere. And that does happen within a single model with and without nitrogen. And I think that was consistent with what Philippe showed as well for IPSL. When you look across the ensemble, it appears that the airborne fraction has actually reduced, and I think that is just simply having lots of changes in the model components. So that's not, so nitrogen has contracted the spread, but it's not actually reduced the magnitude of the airborne fraction.
Thank you, Chris. And there are a couple of other questions in the chat, which I refer you to.
Okay.
Our next speaker is Sujan from MPI, who's going to talk to us about the role of aridity in carbon cycle dynamics.
Thank you. Can you see the screen?
We can.
Okay, so yes, thank you. So the title is the conclusion, but I'll mostly show the results about the evaluation of the carbon cycle in the CRESCENDO models. Okay, doesn't seem to move. So what I'm evaluating in this study is mostly the turnover time of carbon and GPP, and just to give a quick refresh on this one. So basically turnover time is the time that a carbon atom stays in the ecosystem. So basically it determines the feedback of land to the atmosphere. And on the steady state, we can simply calculate it as a ratio of the stock and the GPP, which are available from model simulations. And just by looking at this question, what you can see is basically the sensitivity of tau and GPP to climate also shapes the variation of total carbon stock. And what I used as a data in this one are the mean spatial patterns of the turnover time on the left, GPP in the center, and in the stock on the right. What you see is there is a nice mix of the GPP pattern and the turnover pattern in the C total. You do see high stocks in the tropics where there is large GPP, and you see also the large stocks in the high latitudes which are very low decomposition rate. So basically, which aspect of climate drives this special pattern of these three, and we look at it together, and whether the CRESCENDO models are able to reproduce these patterns or not. And to put it very simply, when you plot it as a scatter, for example, the turnover time on the y-axis and GPP in the lower row, and the temperature on the x-axis with also precipitation on the other side, what you do see is the turnover is longer in colder regions, and it's also longer in dry regions that you see with this one. Similarly, the GPP increases when it's warmer or when it's wetter. And this one, this line, however you may fit it, has been used to constrain the variation of stocks in time and to characterize it in different ways. But what you do notice here is there is also large heterogeneity. For the same temperature or precipitation, what you do see is a large differences across different regions for GPP as well as the turnover rate. So what we simply did in the beginning was to divide the whole world into more colorful regions based on the aridity. So I divide the world into basically 4 classes: arid to humid. The arid means is always red and the humid is blue. What we see is there is a nice segregation from global to the local scales, and the arid regions have much longer turnover time irrespective of what temperature you are in. And the same you can also see for precipitation is the difference between different climatic regions is relatively small. And for GPP also is the same with precipitation, but with temperature you see increasing sensitivity with temperature. So there is a distinct pattern based on observation, and the question that we had is whether the models can reproduce this or not. It's very simple, straightforward, should represent. So in this figure, it's a bit busy, but these 4 relationships that I had in the previous slide, they are put together in different rows, and for different climatic regions are different columns. Different colored lines are different models. CRESCENDO models, the S3 simulation, 1990 to 2010, that's the climatological mean. And what you can see, for example, in this red box is the relationship between tau and the climate, is that the models have much larger spread for turnover, irrespective of whether you look at the precipitation or the temperature. And what you see from left to right is from humid to arid regions, this spread increases. On the other hand, if you look at GPP, all the models do relatively well in all the regions, which is quite interesting. But this is just based on aridity, right? So we can look into the detail of why this is happening or why this kind of relationship emerges. And what I plot here, it's again busy, but what you can see in the first column is the zonal distribution of tau, GPP, and C total. In the second and third columns, I have the partial correlations for each latitude region. And when I do the correlation with precipitation, I control for temperature. And when I do it for temperature, I control for precipitation. And the colored lines are all different models. You don't need to worry about them, but the thick blue line and the thick black lines are the multimodal ensemble and observation. What you see, for example, for turnover is the models in general over-predict the strength of the relationship with the temperature, while they under-predict the relationship with the precipitation, especially in this region. You also see it in other regions, but here is quite clear. And if you look at GPP, one thing that is very evident is the models are much closer to each other and also much closer to the observation. So they do GPP relationship even in the local scale very properly. And as a result of these two, what you get for stock is very good relationship for temperature, nice pattern across the latitude with precipitation, but a weaker relationship. So basically what we think is that the precipitation relationship is underestimated in the model, even though the big patterns of having more stock in places with large GPP is there in the model. And if you just quickly confirm it, what you see is in the zonal distribution of the precipitation and the GPP are the same, and the temperature and the tau are opposite. So you do see very clearly both across the observation and the models that this pattern is being produced. And to put it into more summary, what I show here is the multimodal agreement and the observation. What you do see is tentatively they produce similar pattern, longer turnover in the high latitude, shorter in the tropics, and the GPP pattern is also well reproduced. But what we do see is there is a missing part in the semi-arid regions where the observation shows much longer turnover, but the models don't. And this is also the reason where the bias from the models is large, and also the agreement across the model is small. And you can also look at it in the regional scale. You see the same for GPP. Just to put it in context, this was what we had in CMIP 5, now looks a bit better. And thanks to ASM Val tool, we can do it for CMIP 6. It again seems to grow, so there is not much improvement across CMIPs. And lastly, we can diagnose the bias again by comparing the bias in the stock in the y-axis and GPP in the x-axis. And that ratio of these biases will give you the bias in the turnover. So if a model is perfect, you will not see any point, and all the points would fall in this dot that I'm showing with the pointer. What we do see is some models, for example, Joules and Surfax, have large density of points in this ideal point. But most models, what they have is a much larger variation in C total and the biases in C total than in GPP.
2 minutes.
Thank you. And we can go a bit further and look into the model responses and see whether there is a systematic differences. This is again a very busy plot. Each row is a different model. Each column, so first one is the moisture and temperature relationship, for example, from the model. And this is just in space, not in time. Please keep in mind. And these two are the respiration components, and then there is GPP. What you do see in the red box here that I'm pointing is that across the models, you do have a very consistent relationship between temperature and carbon fluxes. But if you look at the moisture that is from within the same model, it's not from the observation, you do see that there are some much larger differences across the models. But one thing that is interesting is both moisture and temperature responses in the model are almost exactly the same for respiration and GPP. So basically, to summarize, aridity seems to separate or offset the turnover with large association with precipitation than anticipated or shown. And when the previous study just look at the global numbers, they can ignore it in a sense that it doesn't contribute to the global signal so much, but it still has around 20% of the global stock. So even with the 80%, you can use the global number to constrain the climate simulations, but in these regions, it's still bad. And the second point is GPP is much better in the model. Probably having the data for so long has helped. So it's getting slightly better in CRESCENDO simulations, but the CMIP 6 don't really show any big improvement compared to CMIP 5. And we do see much larger dependence in the colder region for the temperature, and that is getting worse than before. But it's still difficult to pinpoint processes. And the temperature responses in the model are more consistent than the moisture responses. And within model relationship doesn't hold across the models. So these are just some challenges and conclusion. And with that, I would like to end. Thank you.
Thank you, Sujan. We have a question from Eve. How important is it to represent accurately the semi-arid vegetation in order to get the carbon stocks right in those regions?
I think it's obviously very important to have the right input, right, with the GPP, but what we are seeing is the models are doing well with GPP even in semi-arid regions, but with the decomposition, it looks like the moisture response is not there, or at least masked by temperature, because in semi-arid regions, with the warmer regions also have lower precipitation, but it looks like there is more than just doing the input flux, but rather also some weaknesses in the decomposition processes related to the moisture.
And another question from Colin Jones. Did you drive the land models with observed or modelled precipitation? And are the arid regions difficult because of precipitation biases?
I think in this case, it was driven by Q and SEP, so the analysis data, because it was the S3 simulation, these are not coupled. But yeah, definitely precipitation bias is still there despite using the reanalysis data. And to actually have the full picture, we need to evaluate it in the coupled model, and also coupled in a sense that the land feeds back to the atmosphere, but we don't actually have access to such simulations. So if any of you knows of these simulations, let us know. But it was based on observation-based data.
Thank you. We'll now move on to our next speaker. So Jeremy Walton is going to talk to us about simulations that have been done with UK ESM1 in quantifying the climate response to emissions reductions due to COVID-19 restrictions. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you, Fiona. Can you see my slides? Fantastic. Okay, yes. So good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be talking about simulations that me and Steve Rumbold and Yongming Tang in the UKSM core group have done to look at the climate response to reductions in emissions caused by COVID-19. And we're doing this as part of a model into comparison experiment, COVID MIP, which has been organised and run by Chris Jones, also in the Met Office. So the background to this, as every person in the whole world knows, the pandemic's caused restrictions in travel and other activities, and this has led to reductions in the greenhouse gases and ozone and aerosol precursors. And the question which naturally occurs to us is, does this have an effect on the climate of the Earth as it is now, and what it's going to be like in the future? And so what we've done is we've tried to run some climate simulations using UKSM to find that out. So to do the simulations, we need some future scenarios for emission reductions. These have been produced by Forster and his colleagues. They've been determined both by some what you might call bottom-up estimates from sector activity data, and also from top-down analysis from atmospheric observations. More details about those are contained in the papers that they've written to present those scenarios. They've been used to develop various different scenarios for the future beyond 2020, including this one that we'll be talking about mostly, called the 2-year blip. And what this consists of is a reduction in emissions in the period of January to March of 2020, last year, of these orders of magnitude: 35% for NOx, 5% for CO2, and 5% for CH4. These values aren't very big, but these components are quite long-lived in the atmosphere, and so it'll be interesting to see what their long-term effects are. The idea here is that these emissions stay constant until January of 2022, hence the name 2-year blip, and then they're going to return to whatever they were at pre-2020 levels. So these scenarios have been used to create some set of forcings and to create a modelling protocol, which is the one that we followed using UKSM1. So if we're pushing forward into the future and we'd like to find out what the effect of these changes in emissions are, we need some sort of baseline to measure that against. and the COVID MIP uses the SSP 245 future scenario as the baseline. We apply the 2-year blip forcings at the start of 2020, and our runs here go up to 2050, and we can take the difference in results between 2-year blip minus SSP 245 to show the effect of the emission reductions. We think already that the effect is kind of small compared to other things that are going on, so we'd like to have a large ensemble, and until we did these experiments, our SSP 245 ensemble had 5 members, which perhaps could not be described as large. So the first thing we had to do was to add extra members to that. In the UKSM1 historical ensemble, there are 16 members, and so each of those can be used as a starting point for a future scenario. So we were able to use those to add 11 more members to SSP 245. So a byproduct of this is our SSP 245 ensemble now has 16 members in it, and that's the size of the ensemble that we used for these experiments. And I should say that UKSM1 comes at you in 2 flavors. One is concentration driven and one is emissions driven. I should say that all of our runs are concentration driven. So I'll show you very quickly just 3 sets of results from UKSM1, concentrating on the first 5 years of the experiment. They go up to 2050, but we're initially just looking at the first 5 years. So on the left-hand side here, the green lines are the results from SSP 245. The blue lines are results for the 2-year blip experiment, and we're looking at global aerosol optical depth at 550 nanometers here. So you can see the overall trend. This quantity rises as time goes on. These are the annual means that global annual means that we're plotting. And in order to see the effect of the emissions reductions, we take the blue lines away from the green lines for the corresponding variance in the ensemble. There are 16 members in each, and we generate the difference on the right-hand side here. So the heavy red line here is the ensemble mean, and the shaded area is the size, the standard deviation of this ensemble. So those are the results for global aerosol optical depth. You see there's an initial reduction in that caused by reductions in scenarios, in emissions rather. This is the results for the downward shortwave radiation at the surface. Again, you can see there's a bit of a cat's cradle on the right-hand side there, on the left-hand side, but if you take the green lines away from the blue lines, you get this difference here, which is shows an initial, not statistically significant increase in the amount of downward shortwave radiation at the surface, going away to something smaller. And finally here, if you look at the effect on the global surface air temperature, again on the left-hand side, you can see this quantity is rising as we go forward into the future under both these scenarios. But the difference between the 2-year blip and the SSP 245 baseline scenario here is not very big. In fact, it's statistically insignificant, incomparable from zero. So just to summarize what we found from UKSM1, we got this initial reduction in aerosol optical depth, which became statistically insignificant after 2 years. We saw an initial smaller increase in the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface, which again became insignificant after 2 years. And we found no significant change in the surface air temperature. We can quantify that a little bit. We look at local effects. What we found is a small increase in the 2024 average over areas like Russia and Antarctica, and a small decrease over the Arctic. But these rises and falls are quite small. As I said, that's 0.25 degrees C. As I said, we did this as part of a MIP called COVID MIP. This consists of 12 models, including UKSM1, running over 300 simulations in multiple initial condition ensembles. And the headline result here is that what we found for UKSM1 is consistent with what other models found and what the multi-model ensemble for COVID MIP shows us. So again, I'll just go through those very quickly here. This is for the global aerosol optical depth. This is the result for UKSM1 down here, and at the top is that multi-model ensemble. You can see they're qualitatively similar. This is the result we had for the surface downwards shortwave radiation. This is the result down here for UKSM1, multi-model ensemble at the top, again very similar. And this is the result for the global surface air temperature, UKSM1 at the bottom, multi-model ensemble at the top.
2 minutes.
Thank you. So this is just the first part of the work we're doing. We got this initial focus on the short-term part of the experiment, but the full experiments go up to 2050, so they need analysing as well. And also other scenarios have been run into the future as well. So the blue line here is the 2-year blip. As I said, there's this initial reduction of a period of 2 years, and then it goes back to normal. Other ways in which could happen in the future would include a fossil fuel rebound. So again, it goes down to 0, and then we start to use fossil fuels again as we go forward into the future. That's one scenario. And other scenarios would be some use of green, environmentally friendly technology to reduce emissions, either on a moderate stimulus or a strong stimulus. And those scenarios have all been run, and all of those results for UKSM1 are on ESGF and also for some other models as well. So what we found here is the 2020 pandemic. It's had this impact on many aspects of human life on Earth, including health, economics and society, but its scale gives us an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity to study how the planet's climate responds to anthropogenic changes in its atmosphere. Early results from this show no impact on global climate, at least as far as the 2-year blip scenario is concerned. But further analysis is either ongoing or proposed. We could do fixed SST runs to quantify the effective radiative forcing due to emissions reductions. We could also look at local effects, changes in extremes, and the influence on atmospheric circulation. And we also need to do those other analysis of those other scenarios that I mentioned just there, the fossil fuel recovery, the moderate and strong green stimulus. And finally, some people have pointed out that although the idea of a 2-year blip as regards the impact of the pandemic might have looked sensible at the beginning of 2020, the way things are going and the continuing way in which we are or we aren't getting out of lockdown and the effects of the pandemic means that maybe 2 years might not be enough, and so perhaps we should be looking in terms of something like a 4-year blip as a different or an additional scenario going forward into the future. That's all I have to say. I've written this up in the well-known best-selling UKSM1 newsletter, which has came out last month. All of you should be received your copies by now, and this has also been written up in an almost as auspicious publication, Geophysical Research Letters, which has just come out last week, and that's the full treatment of all the results from COVID MIP. So head to that if you want to find out more. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Jeremy. There was a question from Colin on the regional aspects, but you kind of answered that. He was suggesting looking at regional areas and perhaps you would see larger changes, but you did then subsequently refer to the high latitudes, for example.
Sure.
A question from Victor: how have you calculated greenhouse gas concentrations based on the emission reductions?
Well, that work was actually done by the people who produced the experiment protocols, really. So we just took those and used them as forcing conditions in these ensembles. So there'll be references to how those were calculated in those publications that I gave at the end.
Thank you. And a question from Gerd: how long do you think the blip would need to be to have a significant impact on global mean temperature?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's related to the longevity of some of those species. I mean, that the size of the blip for CO2 is only 5%, but it does seem to have some effect there. It's how long they're going to be. Those reductions can live on in the atmosphere. We could do a 4-year blip, and we could see if that makes any difference in the climate, but the headline at the moment is that 2 years doesn't seem to make very much difference in terms of temperature or precipitation, at least based on what we've seen here so far.
Thank you, Jeremy. Victor, Chris has put a link to the paper in the chat there that gives the details on the forcing data.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.
We now move to our final speaker, Victor, who's going to talk to us about the global climate response, but in this case to idealized deforestation using the CMIP6 models. Over to you, Victor. And you'll need to unmute.
Yes, yeah.
When you're ready.
Can you see the full screen?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay, excellent. So I also have to apologize because this presentation, we presented already earlier versions of it at the previous assemblies, but now we have a publication, and I speak here on behalf of Lena Boysen because she just ended her work in CRESCENDO, and you see here that there were many authors from CRESCENDO teams here in listed in black, and that's contribution to CRESCENDO, but also to the analysis, integration, and modeling of system project aims of future Earth, which also has a very strong focus on land use role in the Earth system. And this is experiments which we started to think of 5 years ago. And if you can see on the left, we had a paper about design of this experiment. And at that time, 5 years ago, we were fighting whether deforestation should be tropical or boreal. And at the end, we had a compromise. So we decided that we deforest both tropical and boreal areas. And we decided to remove equal amount of forest in all models in a linear way, 20 million square kilometers. And we chop the forest from the most forested grid cell, so that is 30% of the most forested cells. And now we have a paper published in November last year with results from CRESCENDO, 5 CRESCENDO models, but also 4 models from the other groups across the world. And our novelty is straightforward implementation, so the protocol is similar for all models. We wanted to look at the robust detection of a signal, so it should be really strong and similar to 1% CO2 experiments. That's why it is linear. We want also to analyze signal over time, so how quickly the signal develops, and we do biophysical and carbon cycle effects in one simulation. And we had 3 models, MPI, ESM, IPSL, and CSM, which had realization using ensemble modes, and in total we have, as I said, 9 models. I thought we tried to make the protocol as standard as possible. The initial forest area, if you look at the list on the right, you can see that in all models the area of a forest varied quite substantially by a factor of 2. Some of models had dynamic vegetation, but some simply had a different forest cover for initialization in pre-industrial. So you can see that most of regions which were deforested indeed were in boreal or tropical areas. And here on the left side, you can see that there are 2 peaks, so in tropical regions, and secondary is in boreal regions. So I thought the particular patterns is different between the models, but we really focused on 2 big regions where deforestation takes place. So that's our temperature response. So we knew in advance that boreal deforestation leads to biophysical cooling. So it's not surprised that this area at the north are blue here with cooling, but and when in the tropics we expected that it will be tropical warming due to reduction in evapotranspiration. But there were some surprises, like UK, ASM, and ECF. They also showed a cooling on the land in tropics, despite of substantial reductions of forest here, which we have not investigated well in details, but there is also in this model a global cooling, which might also affect the land. And there is one model, Burke ESM, which does not seem to be sensitive to deforestation at all. But at the end, if you look at the multi-model means, so all models show that there is a global cooling by about 0.2 degrees. And of course, it's kind of global study, and of course, it's model dependent result. So we wanted also to look at the derivative, so how temperature is changed per unit of deforested fraction. And here, then, if you look at the upper three models, so you see that they're becoming now much more similar, so that we have a strong cooling due to deforestation in high latitudes and warming in tropics. And while with derivatives, of course, they're model dependent, but they might be scenario independent. So when we thought that, well, if you calculate derivatives for every of each models, then we can also use them for future scenarios, not running the exact scenario, but just calculating what would be biogeophysical effect of all these deforestations or changes in land cover in every particular model, which would be a step beyond the current necessity to run all the models with future scenarios. There is an interesting question of where exactly the model changes the sign of temperature response. So here on the left, you can see from the left to right mean temperature change, first on a global scale, which is then damped because there is an ocean response. In the middle, there is a change in temperature over deforested areas. And if you calculate derivative, which in that case would be positive, so that means that with more forests, if you just consider mitigation scenarios with adding more forests in the areas in boreal high latitudes, it will be warming there. And we calculated when the zero, so-called zero latitude, so latitude of change in the sign of temperature response, and that was in the models about 23 degrees north. That means that in these models, if we use mitigation as reforestation option in the extratropics, we will get a warming there, so which is not accounted in the simple models of mitigation calculation. One more result is we were interested in the question when exactly do changes emerge, because if you use ensemble mod, then we can calculate the signal to noise ratio either just directly or in terms of mean of trends. Here the results are in terms of 1 sigma. And if you look at the upper plot, you can see that in the models, so reddish color means actually here in PI, ASM, and IPSL that there is an earlier response after deforestation. So the signal becomes stronger than noise. And interesting is that the signal starts in the center of deforestation. So that's also a very kind of local significant effect and at the center. And another point was that we also wanted to look at the fractions of emergence. So how much one need to deforest just to see the signal above the noise. And that's on the lower plot, you can see it is much more similar between the models. So you see that it's basically about 20% to 30% of forests which one need to get to chop just to see the signal. So it's actually substantial. So that's why just to detect the signal of deforestation in the observation is not that trivial. And now I come to my conclusions. So first of all, we found that biogeophysical effect on global temperature. So it is a cooling, or it ranges from no change, like in MIRAC model, to cooling by ½ degree, and multi-model means about 0.2 degree. So that's substantial. And the second, if you look at the zero latitude, so we know that above 23 degree north, we showed in this experiment reforestation would lead to biogeophysical warming, and that need to be counted when we look at the carbon uptake in these regions. The temperature changes emerge within 50 years over tropical regions, so with strongest deforestation, so it's really hard to see the signal above the noise. If you calculate the biogeochemical effect, then the net effect of deforestation would be a warming, because of course there is a carbon release to the atmosphere and it's dominate 0.5 degree comparing with 4.2. And then sensitivities such as delta T to delta F, we can use them in climate carbon emulators just to check how does it work on a large scale. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Thank you, Victor. We have a number of questions in the chat, so I'll just take two of them. The first one, were you able to diagnose or predict if running in emission mode rather than concentration would affect the change in CO2 airborne fraction from deforestation?
Yeah, so that will be a different type of experiments, which we actually did for CMIP5, because if you deforest it, then you have both biogeophysical effects and biogeochemical due to the warming. But then in the one experiment with emission-driven run, it's mixed up. So in this experiment, we prescribed CO2 concentration to pre-industrial just to separate clearly two effects. But yeah.
Thank you, Victor. There's a question here on BVOC emissions, and in fact, the same question sprung to mind. So is there any suggestion that different treatments of biogenic VOCs within the different models are contributing to differences in their responses to deforestation?
That's a very good question. So I'm not sure how much of BVOC effects was included in the models, and definitely we have not changed our results, so it would not be seen in the results, but that was not included in CMIP6 protocol, but that's of course is an interesting question how BVOC would affect the response. Yes.
Thank you. I refer you, Victor, then to the remaining questions in the chat, if that's okay. All that remains for me to do as chair is to thank all of our speakers this afternoon. A really interesting selection of presentations on carbon cycle dynamics,